thought this little song might fill a little slot on an album, but surely no one would take it seriously. But 60 years later, if you went to hear his band, the Rolling Stones, who are somehow still alive and still going, you will hear this song screamed out by the band and by every single person in the crowd. It's one of their staple songs, and it's called Satisfaction. No satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction. Because I try and I try and I try and I try. I can't get no satisfaction. When I'm driving in my car, when a man comes on the radio, he's telling me more and more about some useless information supposed to fire my imagination, but I can't get no. Can't get no. Hey, 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 that's what I say. I can't get no satisfaction. So I try and I try and I try, but I can't get no satisfaction. That song could not be hidden on a little slot on the back of an album because it is the cry of mankind. It's the national anthem of human nature. We try and we try and we try, but we can't get no satisfaction in this world. Human beings come out of the womb hurting, scared, and unsatisfied. We were satisfied in our warm, safe place in our mommy's tummy, but then we were pushed out and burst forth into a room filled with blinding white lights, and strange creatures hiding their evil intentions behind green or blue face masks. Suddenly they grab us, they flip us upside down, and spank the daylights out of us. Welcome to the world, to this crazy, angry world, where you will be hungry, thirsty, dirty, cold, and hot, and never be fully satisfied again. From now on, you will be looking for that crazy missing piece called satisfaction. Well, that is why we're studying the book of John. I'm having a little trouble with it there. There we go. That's why we're studying this book, because John wants us to know about someone, and he wants us to meet someone who came to this earth to do just that. He came to give us satisfaction. John wants us to find this satisfaction while we're here on this earth. That's why he said this in chapter 20, verse 31, the theme verse of this series. It's the climax of the book. And he says, I've written these things so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in him you may have life or satisfaction. It's this Zoe life, eternal life that starts now and really, really satisfies in his name. So today we're going to see that Jesus came to satisfy our deepest needs. But he wants to take us deeper than our shallow desires. Jesus came to satisfy our deepest needs, but he wants to take us deeper than our shallow desires. Today we look at the feeding of the 5,000, as Andy read for us, or as we called it in the bulletin, if you notice, the feeding of the 10 to 20,000. Which I'll explain in a few minutes. It's one of the most famous stories in the Bible, of course. I'm sure everyone here has heard it and knows it pretty well. But it has so much to teach us. So what I'd like to do first is set the stage and give a little background for the story. There is a lot going on in this story. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle that appears in all four Gospels. It must be that it's such an important miracle that God inspired all four Gospel writers to include it. It is the story that shows the tenderness of Jesus and yet his great power as well. He cares for the needs of people, both physically and spiritually. John, in particular, shows us Jesus at his peak of popularity. And yet, he shows us that this incident will lead him to losing much or even most of his audience by the end of this chapter. They will walk away confused and angry. But one of the benefits of this story being in all four Gospels is that we can gather bits and pieces of the story from each of the other Gospels to fill in the gaps and to catch a broader view of all that is going on. And there's a lot going on in this story. So let me give you a few things in the background. For example, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find out that this story follows the death of John the Baptist being beheaded by King Herod. In Mark and Luke, we read not only about John the Baptist's death, but also that the disciples have just returned from being sent out to minister by Jesus 2 by 2. And they did great things in Jesus' name. In fact, it was so well known that King Herod heard about it, and in his guilt wondered if this Jesus person who was behind all of this was actually John the Baptist risen again. It's the way guilt works. And now, here in John, we remember from last week that Jesus has been in a heated discussion with the religious leaders of Israel about who he is. They've accused him of being a blasphemer by saying that God is his Father and that he and his Father were always at work together, even on the Sabbath. So last week we saw that Jesus gave 4 witnesses, like in a courtroom. He had made these great claims that I and the Father are one. I am equal to the Father. But anybody can make claims. So last week he gave us 4 witnesses. He talked about how John the Baptist was a witness who was prophesied by Isaiah and Malachi that he was coming as the forerunner. He would prepare the way. Crying in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. And Jesus says, he's witness number 1. The prophet said he was coming. He went to witness number 2, which was his signs and miracles. And he said, these are done so that you see that God is my Father. Witness number 3 was God the Father himself, who spoke at his baptism, even though the Pharisees in their hard hearts didn't hear it. But he says, my Father testifies to me. And then the 4th witness was the Scriptures themselves. He went on to say that the Scriptures testify of me, and if you search them so diligently, like you're known to do, you should see me all the way through it. And he particularly zeroes in on Moses and says, when you stand in judgment, it won't be me that judges you, it will be your hero, Moses. So that is really the background of this story. This heated discussion has led up to this. Jesus has made claims, he's called in witnesses, And now he is going to demonstrate great power. There are actually two great, powerful miracles in this story in chapter 6. The first is a miracle of provision, feeding the multitudes. The second one, that night, is a miracle of protection, when he sends his disciples across the Sea of Galilee in a boat and then comes walking to them on the water. This was a long day, a powerful day, where he did things only God can do, providing for a multitude. He did things that Moses, the hero of the Old Testament, did, feeding the multitude. But he is going to show that he is greater than Moses. All of this is in the background. And there's one more thing that's in the background of the story. And that is that in verse 4, John tells us that the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. That is a very key phrase that we shouldn't skip over. This is the second Passover that John mentions. The first one is in chapter 2, where we saw that Jesus cleanses the temple. And the third one will be when he is the Passover lamb himself. And that is exactly 1 year away. This is the second Passover. So in the background of this story is that Jesus knows he has 1 year left. He is the only one who knows that, but it's certainly on his mind. That's the background of this story. And if you listen close, you'll see why each of these elements is important in the story. So let's go to the second thing we want to point out, and that is we want to talk about the needs that are represented in this group. Everyone in this story is a person with needs, and Jesus knows that. So he's coming to help meet those needs because he cares. Notice verse 1 of chapter 6. It says, After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. This is on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, which had been renamed, it says here, the Sea of Tiberias. That was the name that Herod, in honor of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, renamed the Sea of Galilee after him. Herod was always sucking up to the Romans, and this is just one more attempt to win their favor. But Jesus went to the other side, the east side of the Sea of Galilee, to a little town called Bethsaida, which was right on the edge of the area known today as the Golden Heights. Let me back up here. I got these slides out of order. Up at the top of this little map, you see at the top of the Sea of Galilee, this little town, Bethsaida. And you can see the water doesn't quite go up to that now, but it used to back then. And recent excavations, they've found Bethsaida, but they've also seen that the water has receded. But the lake went up there to Bethsaida, and on the other side of Bethsaida is what is known today as the Golden Heights. A beautiful mountainous area, but beautifully rugged and out of Herod's domain. So Jesus goes to the east side, to this town of Bethsaida, in this area that is very rough and rugged. It's a great place to take a break, and that is what Jesus has in mind. But he didn't go alone. He takes his disciples with him. We mentioned that Mark and Luke both tell us that the disciples had just come back from this ministry trip. It's their first time to be able to do ministry together. Those of us who are going to Romania, and some of you can still come with us, but when we go on these kinds of missions trips, one of the scariest things, but one of the most awesome things, is when you get to do ministry, and you come back, like these disciples come back and tell stories of how God, in His grace and mercy, used me to tell the gospel to somebody, and here's what happened. So it's one of those experiences where they are high as a kite with excitement, but they are also exhausted. Anybody who's ever been on one of those trips knows about the exhaustion as well. So Jesus decides it's time to take a break. So the needs that people have, the first ones that we see are the needs of the disciples. They need rest. We're told in Mark 6:31 that Jesus told them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And we'll explain that in a moment. But the idea at the beginning is, come away, let's take a break. The King James Version says, "Come ye apart." And the old saying is, if you don't learn to come apart, you will come apart. It's a ministry lesson. It's a common lesson for all of us. It's the principle of Sabbath. And Jesus understands this, which ironically, this is what the Jews are accusing him of breaking the Sabbath. But of course he didn't break it. He fulfilled it. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. And he understands that his disciples need to take a break. So this leads to the next person that has needs. And it may sound strange, but the next one who has needs is Jesus himself. Jesus needs rest and isolation. All through the Gospels, we see that he understood this, and he would sneak off many times early in the morning while it was still dark, it says, or sometimes, like later in this chapter, late at night. He isolates. He gets with his Father for rest, but not just a nap, but to commune with his Father. It's interesting, when Mark shows us Jesus convincing his disciples to come apart and rest a while, Matthew indicates more of this, of Jesus' own need to get away. Matthew 14 describes the death of John the Baptist in detail. Herod, at a drunken party, has him executed in his cell. His head is cut off and brought out to the party on a silver platter. Matthew says that John's disciples came and they took the body and they buried it. And then it says they went to tell Jesus. And then Matthew says, when Jesus heard it, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. We don't often think of Jesus having needs. Surely he's above that. But no, this shows that he is fully human as well as being fully God. He has emotions. He grows weary. Remember, he took a rest on the well in Samaria because he was tired. It's an indication of his being fully human as well as fully God. He grows weary. He hurts. He cries at the tomb of his dear friend Lazarus, as we'll see in chapter 11. And here, he may have cried in private over his own cousin and dear friend John. As we said, he knows also that in 1 year from this week, he will also be brutally killed. should encourage us that, as the book of Hebrews says, we have a high priest who can sympathize with us in our weakness. So those are the needs of the disciples and the needs of Jesus himself. Well, let's look quickly at the needs of the people. Obviously, the main need that we see in this story is they get hungry. All four Gospels describe the multitude spilling out of the towns and following Jesus and his disciples. So much for the vacation, guys. Sorry about that. Mark says so many were coming and going that Jesus and his disciples had no leisure even to eat. He also says that the people ran out ahead of him. They didn't just follow him, they ran ahead of him, and there were great crowds waiting when the boat pulled up to shore. But back to John 6, our main passage here. John gives us some insight into not only their need, but also their motives. Look at verse 2. It says the large crowd was following him because they saw the signs or the miracles. I'm sorry, I lost my place here. That large crowd was following him because they saw the signs or the miracles that he was doing on the sick. Many of these people were surely desperate, and many were just simply curious. They'd never seen anyone like this man, Jesus. And so they came. Thousands of them. I remember years ago when I went on a missions trip I told you about before to Albania, which was like going back in time about 100 years. They had been under communism for over 70 years. And the dictator had recently died in the early 90s. And we went in the year 2000. It was like going back into our days of the Civil War era. And one of the things I remember was all the sick and hurting people that were there on homemade crutches. People who had broken an ankle or a leg or an arm earlier in life but didn't have a doctor to reset it. I remember staying in the home of a family that had a little boy who had an abscessed tooth while we were there. And he was trying to be quiet at night, but he was crying out in pain. And his daddy loaded him up on a donkey and took him about 8 hours away to get help for his tooth. When you read this story about this large crowd coming because they've heard that Jesus heals the sick, you can see that it's easy for us to pick on them. But many were desperate, either for themselves or for someone else. So those are some of the needs that are here. And that's why thousands of people come. Notice in verse 2 it says, the large crowds were following him, which is the understatement of the year. Like we said, some of the crowd had gotten there ahead of him. But a large crowd to us might be 100 people. But as we'll see, when they sit down to eat, there are 5,000 men besides women and children. I was talking to my dad the other day, and ironically, this came up. He told me that on one of his grandparents' side, there were 13 children. And on the other grandparents' side, they had 12 children. So he had 25 uncles and aunts. People used to have a lot of kids. My dad is 92, so he grew up in the 30s and 40s, and people just had a lot of children. So if you go back to this time, you realize the Jewish people were promised to populate like the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea, there were a lot of women and children there along with these men. So we very possibly could be talking 15 to 20,000 people in this whole crowd. No wonder Mark says they couldn't even move around to eat. These people had all kinds of needs. As we said, many were there for healing. And interestingly, Matthew tells us in his story that Jesus did heal many. John doesn't bring that up, but Matthew does. But all the stories tell us that they got hungry. They'd come a long way. They were out in this desolate area, and there's nowhere to go. So far, though, we've only dealt with surface needs. The disciples need rest. Jesus needs rest and isolation. These people are hungry. But as we said in the main idea, Jesus wants to take them deeper than their surface needs. We might call them like level 1 needs. They're hungry. They're tired. These are physical types of needs. And they're very real. But they're not all that Jesus came to help us with. Jesus sees the deeper needs that we have, the level 2 needs. And he sees this we see this in his response to the people. Notice the contrast between his response and the disciples' response. This is the next point, the response of Jesus. Notice, you see it best in Mark 6, verse 34. Here's Jesus' response. Now, before I put it up, just imagine that you're in the boat. You're exhausted, emotionally and physically, and the guys in the boat with you are exhausted as well. And you've told them we're going to go on a break. This weekend, our youth are going on a retreat to Lake Guntersville. That sounds really fun to me, to take a break and go to the lake. But imagine when you pull up, there are hundreds of people on the beach. In Keith Richards' song, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, he goes on and talks about we're driving around, we're signing this and signing that. I can't get no satisfaction. That's the life of a celebrity. You never get a break. And Jesus has become a celebrity here. So you would think that he'd say, I don't want to sign autographs here. I just want to break, get the crowd out of the way. But here's Jesus' response. Compassion. He sees them not as people who are annoying, but he sees them as sheep. When he went ashore, he saw this great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. That phrase, sheep without a shepherd, shows up through the Old Testament several times about people who are wandering around, tragically lost because the king has died or because their religious leaders are not faithful and they are unsatisfied. They are burdened down with the cares of life. And so here they all are with surface needs and deeper needs. And Jesus doesn't see them as annoying. He sees them with compassion. One of my favorite books that I've ever read is a book that came out just a couple of years ago. Some of you have seen it and read it. If you haven't, I encourage you to. This is called Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland. And in this book, he opens by saying Charles Spurgeon pointed out something, that the Gospels are filled with sermons of Jesus, the stories about Jesus, all these great things. But there's only one place in all 4 Gospels where Jesus reveals his true heart to us. This was Charles Spurgeon. He said in Matthew 11, when Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden in this world, come to me, and I will give you rest. For I am meek and lowly, or gentle and lowly, and you shall find rest for your souls." In this book, as he's introducing it, Dane Ortlund talks about how Jesus is approachable. And you see that in this story as these hungry and desperate people come. Dane says that Jesus is accessible, for all his resplendent glory and dazzling holiness, his supreme uniqueness and otherness. No one in human history has ever been more approachable than Jesus Christ. The minimum bar to be enfolded into the embrace of Jesus is simply open yourself up to him. It is all he needs. Indeed, it's the only thing that he works with. Verse 28 of Matthew 11 tells us explicitly who qualifies for fellowship with Jesus. All you who labor and are heavy laden. You don't need to unburden yourself or collect yourself and then come to Jesus. Your very burden is what qualifies you to come. So Jesus welcomes these annoying thousands of people with a totally supernatural response. We see the natural response in contrast with the disciples, who 2 verses later say, "Send them away." Which crowd would you be in? The crowd that looks, or the one person who looks with compassion? I would be with these guys saying, "Get them out of here. We don't want to sign autographs today. Send them away. Let them go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. Let them take care of themselves." That's the typical human response, but not with Jesus. He sees their deeper need. Because not only are they hungry, that's the level 1 need, but he sees a deeper need. They need spiritual direction. They are not just hungry sheep, they are lost sheep without a shepherd. And that's why it's interesting that Mark says this. He had compassion on them because they were sheep without a shepherd, and so he began to teach them many things. This is the interesting thing, and I'm so glad, as I said, this is in all 4 Gospels, because each Gospel writer gives us a little bit more angle into seeing it here. Because John is going to show us the power of Jesus doing what only God could do, like he did in the wilderness with Moses, feeding multitudes of people. It's interesting if you look back in the book of Exodus and in Numbers, when they leave Mount Sinai, after the great miracle of going through the Red Sea, and God tells Moses that he's going to provide for these people. And Moses is very straight with God and says, "Where are we supposed to get all the animals to feed these people? Are we going to make sacrifices? We don't have any animals for sacrifice, or certainly to feed everybody." Moses is speaking logically. He's like the dad or the mom before you go on a vacation saying, "Did we pack this? Did we have this? Did we have this?" It's good logic. But God says, "Just stay with me. I've got plans that you won't even imagine. I'm going to rain down food on you every morning for the next 40 years. And Jesus knows that he is going to do something even greater. He's the greater Moses. But notice what we just read. He doesn't start with that. He says these people are not just physically hungry, they are spiritually without direction. And he teaches them. We don't know what he taught them. Maybe it's the Sermon on the Mount again to the new crowd. Maybe it was the parables. We don't know. But it was something they needed to give them spiritual direction. It shows the beautiful balance that Jesus has in his ministry. So he teaches them. He also saw a need not just in the people in the multitude, but he saw a deeper need even in the disciples. Yes, they needed rest, but he also sees by their response, get them out of here, that they need some training. Now, in their mind, they just went out and did some big-time ministry, so they're ready. But Jesus says, I think we need to do a little training here. And the training starts with a test to see where they are in their faith. They've been wandering around with him for a little while now. We're in chapter 6. And they've seen the water turn to wine. They've seen Jesus heal the nobleman's son at a distance. They've seen the situation that happened with the Samaritan woman. All these things are really something. They saw the lame man healed at the pool. But their faith is still weak. And so Jesus decides to give them some training. And it starts with a little test. Notice, he doesn't just jump into, guys, get ready. We're going to need to distribute some food. He doesn't say that. He starts with a test. He says to Philip in verse 5, it says, lifting up his eyes and then seeing the large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? What a great question. Philip, we read, is from Bethsaida. So Philip, where are the grocery stores here in Bethsaida or right outside town? Where can we take care of this problem? Philip answered him not by saying where they might get something, but how they might get something. He's thinking logically like Moses was, and he says 200 denarii. A denarii was a coin that was a typical day's wages at the end of the day. So he's talking about a half a year to 3/4 of the year wages is not going to be enough to feed this group of people. We don't have that kind of money, and there aren't that many grocery stores around here anyway. This is a desolate place. Philip is right in his logic, but just like Moses, he is wrong in his faith. He's thinking mathematics when Jesus asks the question, but it's a test. It's a test. Are you going to respond with cold logic of how you can make this happen, or are you going to trust me? Philip is not the only one who is tested, but it says, verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. What a great statement of faith. He points out, and Andrew is the guy who's always bringing someone to Jesus. He finds this boy somehow and gets to know him, and this boy's got this little lunch. And these fish are about the size of sardines in that area. And the idea of the word used for fish are these little fish. And the barley loaves, barley is the bread of the poor people. It was the lower grade of bread. And it's small. One commentator said they were about the size of Hostess Twinkies. So maybe they had a little more nutritional value than Twinkies. But there are 5 little Twinkie-sized loaves and a couple little sardines. And so Andrew gets excited and says, we got a kid here who's got lunch. And then he adds to it, but what are those? What are they for so many? That won't work. Sorry, Jesus. I didn't mean to get you excited there. Both guys illustrate our typical response to a test. How can we make this happen? Our first reaction is, it depends on me. I got to fix this. And Jesus says, no. That is not how it works. Today is the Super Bowl. And for the last 2 weeks, the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles have been practicing. And when they practice, they put each side, the offense or the defense, to test. Jalen Hurts is going to run this way. He's going to drop back to pass, and then he's going to run. So while we're practicing, you pretend to be Jalen Hurts offense, and you come in defense, and somebody better pick up Devontae Adams going down the field too. Or on the other side, Patrick Mahomes is just all over the place. So let's run every test we can and just hope we can catch him. That's what you do, is prepare for the test. And Jesus says, I want to train you guys, so here's the test. Do you believe me? And they say, this is not going to rationally work. Well, the test goes on and becomes a lesson in participation. It's interesting that Jesus, who's training them in ministry, gets them involved. He says, have the people sit down, verse 10. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Again, just the men there. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. But as we'll see, he didn't just distribute them by himself. He starts dividing the loaves, and they just keep dividing. Can you imagine the sight of that as people are sitting there? They're hungry, and they see him start to break this bread, and then he continues and continues and continues, and then they start passing it out. It's one of those miracles where he doesn't call out to everybody and make a big announcement about it. He just does it. As they start passing the loaves out, can you imagine the people going, there's enough for me? Pass it down, pass it down. There's more coming? Oh my goodness, what is going on here? This is an absolute supernatural miracle. It's greater than Moses. Can you trust me to provide? Jesus says, I am the new Moses, the greater Moses. Because I am not going to just provide physically for you. I'm going to provide spiritually as well, because you need direction. But he involves the disciples in passing it out. Notice the order that this is carried out in. Jesus is not sloppy about this. He gets everybody organized. He's like the ultimate superintendent here, but he uses his people. It's a great lesson for all of us in the body of Christ that Paul tells us we're members and we need to use our gifts. This is probably a good opportunity to tell you, we have been through this pandemic and we're still rebounding like most churches. But I want to encourage you to say, Lord, what serving gifts have you given me? One of the ministries that we really are praying about and discussing how we can get it launched again is our children's ministry. And we've got some good things happening with some great discussions and some things we'll be mentioning to you. But we want you to pray about that. We are seeing some great things happen with the small groups, the Bible studies on Tuesday. We want to continue those things. But the Lord works through his people. And Jesus demonstrates that. He involves them in participating, in serving. Before we go to Thanksgiving, let me say one other participant in this is this little boy. We don't know his name. We don't know anything about him. He's just a kid, and his mom he's apparently the only kid whose mom remembered to send him a little lunch. But it's just enough for him. But he gladly gives it away. What a kid. He's part of the team. He participates. He has great faith, apparently. A little child shall lead them. But notice, Jesus also brings into this equation Thanksgiving. This is worship. Before he passes it out, it says, he says a blessing. He reminds everybody what is really happening, and he'll tell the people in the latter part of chapter 6, what happened in the Old Testament was not from Moses. It was my Father bringing it down every morning. And by giving thanks, he is saying the same thing. This is from my Father. He and I are always at work, and we are working together right now. And we can do anything at any time, even on the Sabbath. Do you have that kind of faith? When the money is tight at the end of the month, when you have some kind of need in the family, when you are worried about your children, about your marriage, your relationship, do you have the kind of faith that says, God, I can't fix this. Please intervene. Please be accessible. Please welcome me. Don't send me away. This is a vertical relationship coming down from the Father above through his wonderful Son. So it's worship. And he feeds the people. And they are fully satisfied. It says that when he took the loaves and when he had given thanks, he distributed it to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. Anybody want seconds here? We got plenty. As a matter of fact, when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftovers, that nothing may be lost. Again, he's even sensitive. He's a recycler. He's taking care that we don't leave trash around. We don't want the unbelievers thinking we're a bunch of jerks. And he just happens to leave enough so that there's 12 baskets left. Commentators go back and forth what that means, but it's probably, James, you take a basket. John, you take a basket. Peter, you take one. 12 of you. You got 12 baskets. Thanks for helping me today. But Jesus sees everything through. So they gathered them up, filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who were eaten. They were satisfied. They all had eaten their fill. Jesus gives total satisfaction. We can get satisfaction when you know Jesus. It doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect in your life. But we know something that poor Keith Richards has apparently never figured out. That Jesus comes to satisfy. Just quickly, we'll leave this here because we'll pick up here next week. But it ends with, this accessible Jesus ends with a refusal. Look at verse 15. or verse 14 and 15. When the people saw this sign, there's the word, a sign points to who he is. This is one of the 7 great signs in the book. When they saw this sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." Now that would be a great compliment if you came up to me today and said, "Tim, you sounded like a prophet today." I'd say, "Gee, thanks. That's awesome." But to Jesus, that's not awesome. It's not high enough. Moses said, "There's a prophet coming after me that you better listen to." And he's really pointing to Jesus. But the idea here is, I'm not just a prophet. I am equal with God. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, or the word means Messiah, Jesus withdrew again. He went into isolation again on the mountain by himself. Well, Jesus, that's kind of rude. You've been welcoming these people, you taught them, you distributed the food, you participated with everybody. Everybody's happy. They're excited. Can you blame them? What a great king you would make. And Jesus says, I came to satisfy the deepest part of you. But I am not here to give you your shallow desires. Later in chapter 6, he's going to say, you are here because you liked the loaves. I came here to give you myself, and you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. That's coming. It's just a little invitation to you to come back. Because Jesus is saying, I am going to take you deeper. Now here's the end, and we'll pray. Let's put ourselves in their shoes. Do we follow Jesus because we have to feed on him and drink from him daily for our life? Or do we look at him who is king of my life and gives me all the candy I want? Jesus has been so good to me. I've got a nice house. I've got a nice family. Why wouldn't I follow him? And Jesus says, I didn't come here for that. I came to satisfy the deepest need you have, but I will not be a puppet for you. People in the Bible Belt, where everybody loves Jesus and we're always satisfied with him until we get sick or until somebody dies. Jesus says, I came to give you a deep satisfaction, not just to give you candy. Shallow desires, like these poor people. They love the loaves. He says, I came to give you myself. Follow me. Let's pray. Father, teach us what it means to be your followers. We're going to see that many followers turned away, and we would too. I pray that our heart will be to feed on you, to know you intimately, to walk with you through life, to allow you to be our good shepherd, because we are wandering sheep without you. Help us to meet you at a deeper level. Be our shepherd.